Now, let's look at an example of a 2020 case study. For the federal revenue, for instance, in 2020, the federal government collected $3.42 trillion in revenue based on data from usaspending.gov. To have an idea of $3.42 trillion is the same amount as 65 million individuals, each receiving $52,580 per year. So you can see in this picture that this picture is coming from the US Department of the Treasury, that the US government is very good in collecting revenues. For example, from 2006 to 2020, the revenue collected per year is more than 3 trillion. Now, let's talk about the federal government spending. For instance, in 2020, the federal government spent 6.55 trillion US dollar, and especially due to the response for the COVID-19 pandemic. To have an idea of $6.55 trillion is equivalent to every US household spending $4,200 per month. So you can see in this picture that the spending is increasing. For example, from 2006 to 2020, the federal spending amount went from almost 4 trillion in 2016 to 6.55 trillion in 2020. Now about the deficit. For instance, in 2020, the federal government spent 3.13 trillion US dollar more than it collected. To have an idea, 3.13 trillion is about 4 times the amount of total credit card debts American held in 2020. So you can see easily in this image, these amounts: revenue, spending, and deficit. A deficit occurs when money going out exceed the money coming in. In 2020, the federal government spent more than it collected. To pay for a deficit, the government takes on debt. The total debt that the government owes is essentially the accumulation of deficits owed over time minus repayments of debt. The government can also use operating cash, which is available at the Federal Reserve, to pay for deficit spending. A surplus occurs when the government collects more than it spends. The last federal surplus occurred in 2001. The government primarily uses surpluses to reduce the federal debt, and since 2001, the US has experienced a deficit each year. Beginning in 2016, increases in spending on Social Security, healthcare, and interest on federal debt have outpaced the growth of federal revenue. So about the federal debt, for instance, by the end of 2020, the government had 26.95 trillion US dollar in federal debt. And to have an idea, 26.95 trillion is equal to a little less than $82,000 per individual in the US. And you can see in this image from the US Department of Treasury that from 2019 to 2020, $4.2 trillion was added to the federal debt. To pay for the deficit, the federal government borrows additional funds, which increases the debt. So, are the federal debt and deficit the same thing? No, but they affect one and each other.